There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from suffering in silence, not because you choose to be quiet, but because every time you try to explain what you're feeling, you can see it in their eyes. That subtle shift, that moment when they stop truly listening and start waiting for you to finish so they can offer advice you didn't ask for, or reassurance that feels like dismissal. You've learned to say you're fine when you're not, to minimize your struggles when someone asks how you're doing, to carry weight that no one else can see because you've discovered something devastating. Your pain doesn't make sense to other people. It doesn't fit into the categories they understand. It can't be fixed with the solutions they're comfortable offering. And so you begin to wonder, in those quiet moments when the ache feels unbearable, if maybe they're right. Maybe you're being dramatic. Maybe you're too sensitive. Maybe everyone else just handles things better and there's something fundamentally wrong with you for struggling this much with something that seems so manageable to everyone around you. But what if I told you that this doubt, this questioning of your own experience, this sense that your pain needs external validation to be real, is actually a form of suffering all its own, one that amplifies the original wound and creates a vicious cycle that traps you between the reality of what you feel and the isolation of not being believed? Let me take you somewhere unexpected, somewhere that will help us understand why validation matters so much and why its absence can be more damaging than the original pain itself. Imagine you're standing in a room with 20 other people, and everyone is told to submerge their hand in ice water for 60 seconds. The instruction is simple. Keep your hand in the water no matter how uncomfortable it gets. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Scientists have actually run this experiment, and what they discovered reveals something profound about human pain. When people do this alone, in silence, with no one acknowledging their discomfort, they rate their pain significantly higher than when they do it in the presence of someone who simply says, "I can see this is difficult for you." Not offering solutions, not trying to fix anything, not comparing their experience to anyone else's, just witnessing and acknowledging what's happening. The pain itself, the physical sensation, doesn't change. The ice water is the same temperature, the nerve endings are sending the same signals to the brain, but the experience of that pain, the suffering that wraps around the sensation, fundamentally transforms when someone else recognizes it as real. This isn't just about ice water, and it's not just about physical pain. This is about something deeper, something that explains why you can survive incredible hardship if someone stands beside you and says, "I see how hard this is." But you can crumble under relatively minor stress if you're met with indifference or dismissal. The human brain processes pain, both physical and emotional, through multiple pathways, and one of the most powerful modulators of that pain isn't medication or distraction or willpower, it's social connection, specifically the experience of having your suffering recognized as legitimate by another person. When that recognition is absent, when your pain is questioned or minimized or compared unfavorably to someone else's greater suffering, something happens in your nervous system that actually amplifies the original distress. You're not imagining it. You're not being weak. You're experiencing a biological response to social invalidation that's as real as the pain itself.
But here's where most people get stuck. Here's the trap that keeps you suffering longer than necessary. We've been taught to believe that validity is something external, something that requires consensus, something that only exists if other people agree with our assessment of our own experience. Think about how bizarre this is. You are the only person living inside your body, the only consciousness experiencing your particular constellation of sensations and emotions and memories, the only expert on what it feels like to be you. And yet you've been conditioned to doubt your own internal experience until someone else confirms it. This conditioning starts early. When you fell as a child and cried, how many times were you told, "You're okay, it's not that bad, stop crying"? The message was clear. Your assessment of your own pain is unreliable. Trust the adult's judgment instead. When you were anxious about something and expressed fear, how often did you hear, "There's nothing to be afraid of, you're being silly, everyone else is fine"? Again, the lesson: your internal experience is invalid if it doesn't match external reality as perceived by others. We carry this training into adulthood, and it creates a terrible vulnerability because now we need other people to tell us that our pain is real before we can fully acknowledge it ourselves, before we can seek help, before we can treat ourselves with the compassion we desperately need. And what happens when that validation doesn't come? What happens when you're struggling with something invisible, something that doesn't leave marks people can see, something that doesn't fit neatly into categories others understand? You suffer twice, once from the original pain, and again from the isolation of not being believed, from the shame of thinking you should be able to handle this, from the exhaustion of constantly questioning whether you're justified in feeling what you feel. Let me give you a concrete example, one that might feel familiar. You're going through a breakup, not from a dramatic relationship filled with obvious toxicity, but from something more ambiguous, a relationship that looked fine from the outside, where the person never hit you or cheated on you or did anything that would make your pain obviously legitimate in other people's eyes. But you know in your bones that this relationship was slowly eroding your sense of self, that you were shrinking to accommodate someone else's needs, that you were performing a version of yourself that felt increasingly hollow. So you end it, and you're devastated, genuinely grieving, struggling to get through basic daily tasks. But when you try to talk about it, when you reach out for support, you encounter responses that feel like small betrayals. They weren't even that bad. Why are you so upset? At least you weren't married. At least you didn't have kids together. You'll be fine in a few weeks. And suddenly, you're not just dealing with heartbreak, you're dealing with the meta pain of having your heartbreak dismissed, of feeling like you need to defend your right to grieve, of wondering if maybe everyone else is right and you're being ridiculous for struggling this much. Or maybe it's not a relationship. Maybe it's a job that's destroying you from the inside, not through obvious abuse, but through death by 1,000 cuts, through subtle erosion of your boundaries, through the slow accumulation of disrespect disguised as professionalism. You're exhausted, anxious, dreading each workday, but when you mention it to others, they say, "Every job is stressful, at least you're employed. People would kill for your position." The implication is clear. Your suffering is invalid because others have it worse, because you should be grateful, because real pain requires more dramatic circumstances than what you're experiencing. And so you stay, you push through, you tell yourself to stop complaining, and the damage accumulates day after day, month after month, while you gaslight yourself into believing that what you're experiencing isn't really that bad. Here's the truth that no one wants to say out loud. There is no objective scale for suffering. There is no universal measurement that can determine whose pain is valid and whose isn't. The person who rates their discomfort as an 8 on a pain scale isn't experiencing less pain than someone else who rates theirs as a 9. They're simply two different people with two different nervous systems interpreting sensations through two different sets of life experiences, and both of those experiences are equally real to the person living them. When we try to create hierarchies of suffering, when we say things like, "Other people have it worse," or "At least you're not dealing with X," we're not helping anyone. We're not motivating people to feel better or putting things in perspective. We're simply adding isolation to pain, shame to struggle, and teaching people that their internal experience can't be trusted. But why do we do this? Why are humans so quick to invalidate each other's pain? Part of it is discomfort. When someone shares genuine suffering with us, it creates an obligation to witness, to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge that we can't fix everything. It's much easier to minimize, to offer quick solutions, to change the subject, because then we can maintain our own sense of control, our own illusion that pain is always manageable if you just have the right attitude or tools. When we say, "It's not that bad," what we're often really saying is, "Please don't make me feel helpless. Please don't remind me that suffering exists, that I can't solve. Please let me maintain my comfortable distance from the reality of human fragility." the invalidation isn't really about you. It's about their own anxiety, their own need to believe that pain is always proportional to circumstances, that if they just avoid certain situations, they'll be safe from suffering. There's also comparison, the deeply ingrained habit of measuring our experiences against others and using that comparison to determine validity. We live in a culture obsessed with ranking and rating, with determining who's on top and who's at the bottom, and we've applied this same competitive framework to suffering. Someone always has it worse, which means your pain can always be dismissed as not bad enough to warrant attention or compassion. But here's what that logic misses. The fact that someone else is experiencing greater hardship doesn't change what's happening in your body, in your mind, in your life. If you break your arm, the fact that someone else broke both legs doesn't make your arm hurt less. If you're grieving a loss, the fact that someone else lost more doesn't make your grief less real. Pain isn't a competition, and the person who's suffering most doesn't win a prize. We all lose when we create systems that require us to prove our pain is bad enough to deserve acknowledgement. And then there's the insidious voice of toxic positivity, the cultural mandate to be grateful, to focus on the good, to maintain an upbeat attitude regardless of circumstances. This isn't genuine optimism or helpful refraining. This is the demand that you perform happiness, even when you're dying inside, that you suppress legitimate pain because it makes other people uncomfortable, that you prioritize their comfort over your own well-being. When someone responds to your pain with "everything happens for a reason," or "just think positive," or "focus on what you have instead of what you lack," they're not offering wisdom. They're asking you to disappear, to make yourself smaller, to hide the parts of your experience that remind them that life is sometimes simply hard and unfair and devastating without any redemptive meaning. So what do you do when you're in pain and no one understands? How do you navigate the gap between your internal experience and external validation? First, and this is crucial, you have to reclaim authority over your own experience. You are the expert on what it feels like to be you. Not your mother, not your therapist, not your best friend, not the internet strangers who confidently proclaim what you should or shouldn't be feeling. Only you have access to the full complexity of your inner world, and your pain doesn't require external permission to be real. This doesn't mean you're always right about everything, doesn't mean your interpretations are always accurate, doesn't mean you shouldn't seek perspective from others. It means that the sensation itself, the fact that you're experiencing distress, is inherently valid simply because you're experiencing it. You don't need to prove it. You don't need to justify it. You don't need to make it make sense to anyone else.
Second, you need to recognize that other people's inability to understand your pain says more about them than about you. We can only recognize in others what we've experienced ourselves or what we've taken the time to genuinely learn about. If someone has never experienced chronic pain, they literally cannot imagine what it's like to wake up every day in a body that hurts. If someone has never felt the particular terror of a panic attack, they cannot understand why you can't just calm down. If someone has never experienced the soul-crushing weight of depression, they cannot comprehend why getting out of bed feels impossible. Their incomprehension isn't evidence that you're being dramatic. It's evidence of the limits of human empathy across different lived experiences. And while it's painful to not be understood, you can learn to hold your experience as valid, even when others can't see it. Just as you can know the sky is blue, even if you're talking to someone who's colorblind. Third, you have to be willing to grieve the validation you're not getting. This is where a lot of people get stuck. They keep returning to the same people who can't or won't understand, keep trying to explain in different ways, keep hoping that if they just find the right words, finally someone will get it.
But sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to accept that certain people will never understand, not because you're failing to communicate clearly, but because they lack the capacity or willingness to sit with your pain. This acceptance isn't giving up. It's redirecting your energy away from trying to convince the unconvincible and toward finding or creating the support you actually need. And here's something that might surprise you. You can provide some of that validation for yourself. This isn't the same as the toxic self-reliance that says you should never need anyone. That's just independence disguised as strength. This is about developing an internal voice that can witness your own pain with compassion, that can say, "This is hard. I see how much you're struggling. Your pain makes sense." When you notice you're suffering, instead of immediately questioning whether you should be, instead of comparing your pain to others, instead of trying to logic yourself out of your feelings, pause. Place a hand on your heart, take a breath, and say either out loud or silently, "This is painful, and that's okay." You're not being dramatic, you're being human. But let's be honest, sometimes self-validation isn't enough. Sometimes you need another person to reflect your experience back to you, to help you know you're not crazy, to share the burden of witnessing. And if the people currently in your life can't provide that, it might be time to expand your search. This could mean finding a therapist who specializes in your particular struggle, someone trained to understand the nuances of what you're experiencing. It can mean joining support groups, either in person or online, where you can connect with others who share similar experiences and can validate each other. It could mean reading books or listening to podcasts by people who've been through what you're going through, finding validation in the recognition that your experience isn't unique, that others have felt this way and survived. Sometimes just knowing you're not alone, even if the people around you don't understand, can provide enough validation to keep going. There's also something powerful about reframing what understanding means. We often want people to understand our pain by feeling it themselves, by experiencing the same sensations and emotions, but that's not actually possible. No one can truly feel what you feel. But people can bear witness, and sometimes that's enough. The difference between someone who validates your pain and someone who doesn't isn't that the first person understands exactly what you're going through. It's that they're willing to believe you when you describe your experience, to honor your reality even if it's foreign to them, to sit with you in your pain without needing to fix it or minimize it or rush you through it. That kind of witnessing doesn't require identical experience. It requires empathy, presence, and the courage to acknowledge suffering without turning away. Let me tell you what happens when you finally stop waiting for validation from people who can't give it, when you claim the authority to name your own pain as real. Something shifts, some internal burden lifts, because you're no longer expending energy on the exhausting work of justifying your experience. You can use that energy for healing instead, for seeking actual help instead of permission to seek help, for treating yourself with compassion instead of judgment. You'll probably still wish people understood. The loneliness of invisible suffering doesn't completely disappear, but it becomes more bearable when you're not also fighting yourself, when you're not adding your own voice to the chorus of invalidation, when you can look at your pain clearly and say, "This is real. This matters. I deserve support, even if no one else recognizes that." And here's the beautiful, unexpected thing that often happens. When you validate your own pain, when you stop trying to convince others and simply start honoring your own experience, you actually become more capable of receiving validation when it does come. You stop being so desperate for it, so willing to accept crumbs of acknowledgement from people who fundamentally misunderstand you. You develop the discernment to recognize genuine support when you encounter it, and the boundaries to protect yourself from people whose responses, however well-intentioned, cause more harm than good. You learn that not everyone earns the right to hear about your deepest pain, and that's not because you're being closed off or defensive, it's because your pain is sacred, and you're learning to treat it that way.
If you're watching this right now and feeling seen, feeling that recognition that yes, this is what I've been experiencing, I want you to hear something clearly. Your pain is valid. Not because I understand it, not because I can relate to your specific circumstances, not because I think it meets some threshold of severity. Your pain is valid because you're experiencing it, because it's real in your body and your mind and your life, because suffering doesn't require external verification to exist. Whatever you're going through, whatever weight you're carrying, whatever struggle you wake up with every morning that no one else can see, you're not being dramatic, you're not too sensitive, you're not weak for finding this hard. You're human, and being human means sometimes experiencing pain that doesn't make sense to anyone else, that doesn't fit into neat categories, that can't be fixed with simple solutions. You don't owe anyone an explanation that satisfies them. You don't need to make your pain palatable or understandable or proportional to external circumstances. You don't need permission to acknowledge your own suffering. And you definitely don't need to wait until things get bad enough that everyone agrees you're justified in struggling. By then, you've suffered longer than necessary. You've internalized shame that doesn't belong to you. You've denied yourself compassion when you needed it most. Start now, wherever you are, whatever you're feeling. Place your hand on your heart, take a breath, and give yourself the validation you've been seeking from others. Say it. My pain is real. My struggle is valid. I deserve support and compassion. Say it until you believe it, until it becomes the foundation you build your healing on, until the absence of external validation becomes less important than the presence of your own recognition. Because here's the truth. Other people's understanding is a gift when it comes, but it's not a prerequisite for your pain to matter. You matter, your experience matters, and the journey from seeking validation outside yourself to finding it within, from needing others to confirm your reality to trusting your own internal knowing, that journey is itself a form of healing, a reclaiming of authority over your own life, a refusal to let others define the limits of your legitimate suffering. Walk that path, even if you walk it alone. The validation you've been seeking is already there, waiting inside you, ready to be claimed the moment you're ready to believe that your experience of your own life is enough.